Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for being out here for our first virtual session of this year's Audubon Florida Assembly. We're excited to share with you this year's slate of conservation priorities for adoption at this evening's annual Conservation Agenda Setting webinar. I think most of you already know me. I'm Mary Jean Yan. I'm the chair of Audubon Florida's Policy Committee. I'm excited to be here tonight to work through this conservation agenda and approve the statewide and regional conservation priorities. Thank you to our sponsors for Audubon Florida's Assembly this year. Our host sponsor is Public Supermarkets. Partner sponsors include Duke Energy, the Ferber Company, Florida Power and Light, the Mosaic Company, Tico Energy, and Vortex Optics. We also have program sponsors of Disney and Suncoast Credit Union, and support sponsors Likes Brothers, Inc., and Vulcan Materials Company and Holbrook Travel. I have a few housekeeping things to go through before we begin. We're in meeting mode today, so please make sure you're on mute as you participate this evening. We're accepting questions through the chat, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. And we're also offering captions as we go along. You can see these in screenshot here, but you can turn them on via the transcript button, which is at the bottom of your screen. The entire session is going to be recorded and available after assembly. So if you don't get enough listening tonight, you can go back and listen again. And I think with that, we're ready to get started. Okay. So a little bit of background. When Audubon Florida was formed as an alliance of the National Audubon Society, Florida Audubon Society, and the Audubon chapters, the new state board of directors made a commitment to work on conservation. To achieve this, the board committed to holding an annual Audubon assembly to set conservation priorities and to organize regional conservation committees, which we refer to as RCCs, and they coordinate chapter conservation work. The regional conservation committees are designed to coordinate the work of Audubon chapters on regional priorities that are in alignment with Audubon Florida's policy priorities, which are those policy priorities are coastal conservation, water, climate, working lands, and bird-friendly communities. Each RCC is then asked to propose and present a regional conservation priority resolution at the Audubon Assembly that addresses the 2 to 3 common priorities that RCC chapters will work together on during the coming year. Audubon Florida's Policy Committee recommends the statewide conservation priorities. Regional resolutions, are independent of these state conservation policies. The regional and state conservation priority resolutions are to be ratified on October 28th, 2023 at the annual board meeting, and then presented to the Audubon Florida Board of Directors for final approval. These resolutions become the guiding documents for implementing Audubon Florida's conservation action agenda for the next year. This process fulfills the commitment that we have to National Audubon. While this process sounds as though it might be brief, what you're hearing tonight, please be assured that considerable planning, thought, and collaboration took place in the many months leading up to today. The complete priority documents have been posted on the Assembly website, and then they will ultimately result on the Audubon Florida website. So with that, I'd like to get us going, and I'd like to invite one by one a staff member from each of the Audubon Florida policy areas and a representative from each of the chapter regions that are going to share the highlights. Erica Zambello will then call for a vote to accept after everyone has spoken. So just to say that again and put a finer point on it, we're going to go through each of these 12 presentations, and then Erica will call for a vote. So sit back and enjoy, and we'll get started with our state conservation priorities. And the first one will be coastal conservation, presented by Audrey DeRose Wilson.
Good evening, everyone. Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon Florida, and I'm going to talk to you about our coast. coastal areas. Shorebirds and seabirds stop over during hemispheric migrations, and raptors follow the dune lines as they work their way south. Neotropical songbird migrants facing daunting odds of long overwater flights use coastal habitats as the last south
Audrey,
points
sorry,
and
Audrey.
first northbound landfalls. Florida's bird life is too.
Audrey, you are coming in and out a little bit. Can you turn your video off? And then I think your connection will stabilize. Never fear, folks. If it doesn't, we have the comments and we will make sure that you have your coastal conservation. But Audrey, I think turning off your video will help. So go start from the beginning.
In our coastal areas. Shorebirds and seabirds stop over during hemispheric migrations.
Audrey, if you can
raptors follow the dune lines. They work their way south. Neotropical songbird
Okay. Sorry, Audrey. I didn't mean to use my overarching powers here, but I'm going to, hi everybody, I'm Erica Zambello. I'm the communications director. I'm going to present the coastal conservation section just as Audrey's connection stabilizes, but I'm sure she can see the chat. If you have any questions about what I'm about to say, you can put it in the chat and Audrey can circle back. All right. Everyone can hear me just fine, right? Someone, Mary Jean, I think you're off mute. You can hear me all right?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Florida's significance as part of the Atlantic Flyway is most evident in our coastal areas. Shorebirds and seabirds stop over during hemispheric migration, and raptors follow the dune lines as they work their way south. Neotropical songbird migrants, facing daunting odds of long overwater flights, use coastal habitats as their last southbound jumping off points and first northbound landfalls. In fact, the geology of Florida's coasts is always in flux, and so is Florida's bird life. Coastal ecosystems contribute substantially to Florida's economic vitality and quality of life, yet unfortunately are threatened by excessive nutrient loads in urban and agricultural runoff, beach grooming, coastal development, coastal armoring and dredging, and human recreation activity that disturbs birds. Because of the extraordinary value and tremendous vulnerability of coastal habitats, Audubon Florida and National Audubon Society rank coastal conservation among our highest priorities. Not only does Florida have the largest coastal program among the states, we also channeled considerable financial funding into coastal resiliency projects. Audubon resolves to employ sound science to guide conservation at coastal priority geographies and to engage a diversity of people in protecting Florida's special coastal places through partnerships such as the Florida Shorebird Alliance. We will recruit and train bird stewardship volunteers from a broad diversity of communities and share with them the joy of birds nesting on beaches, rooftops, and mangrove islands. We will advocate for birds and priority habitats by supporting conservation-based policies and climate change planning efforts. We will continue to advocate for the protection and acquisition of upland and near coast conservation lands to provide for coastal birds as sea level rises. We will promote planned shoreline retreat for vulnerable human communities rather than armoring in response to sea level rise in priority coastal geographies. We will advocate for freshwater management rules and policies that reduce nutrient loads funneled into coastal waters to decrease the frequency and duration of red tide and cyanobacteria outbreaks. And we will advocate for the protection of coastal habitat from the effects of climate change in ways that will prevent climate change gentrification. That is the coastal section, so I will turn it over to the next person.
Actually, let me jump in here for a minute as Erica and Audrey, thank you for that. And Audrey, I neglected to say your title, the Director of Bird Conservation. So it just wouldn't be a Zoom call if there wasn't a little bit of technical difficulties, right? So next up is a state conservation priority for water, and Kelly Cox will present. And Kelly is the Director of Everglades Policy.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Kelly Cox, Director of Everglades Policy. It is my pleasure to be able to speak with you this evening and present our state conservation priority of water with you all today. Water, as you all know, connects and defines Florida's natural ecosystems from springs to rivers to wetlands and seagrass beds. It's the basis of our ecology and our economy here in the state of Florida. However, our water resources have faced a number of threats over the years. Alteration of our landscape has contributed to over drainage of our wetlands and depleted our aquifers. Pollution has caused many of our waterways to become degraded and impaired, bringing about significant harm to fish and wildlife through events like cyanobacteria blooms and red tide. And increasingly high demands for water throughout the state, coupled with dwindling natural storage capacity, have created a struggle for water between people and the environment. And these threats make it all the more challenging for our natural environments to support birds like roseate spoonbills, wood storks, snail kites, grasshopper sparrows, and even flamingos. And of course, this demands us to take action. So therefore, Audubon staff and the chapters resolved to take actions described in the state conservation priority for water. The full text will be available online, and I'll just summarize a few key objectives that really resonated with our policy team for you now. The first of which is to protect water at the source. We're going to do this by encouraging the expansion and improvement of floodplains, spring shed, and water recharge protection through public land acquisition, conservation easements, and restoration programs. And by working to improve wetland protections at state and local levels through increased scrutiny of regulatory agency actions, such as FDEP's Clean Water Act permitting authority. We will also resolve to advocate for sustainable water supplies for built-in natural systems by supporting water conservation programs, water use reduction, and use of alternative water supplies as conditions in water supply consumptive use permitting. And by promoting sustainable alternative water supply projects, including those that use reclaimed and storm water that improve conditions in natural systems while protecting them from pollution. We further resolve to advocate for water quality improvements by campaigning for stronger state and local stormwater and wastewater treatment requirements that protect ecological health, and by seeking to improve agricultural water use and management through the improvement of the substance, funding, enrollment in, and enforcement of agricultural best management practices. We resolve to continue our longstanding work to protect and restore America's Everglades by securing increased and consistent funding at the state and federal levels to advance the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan and other key Everglades restoration projects, such as the EAA reservoir, in order to increase freshwater storage, maximize freshwater flows, and achieve maximum ecosystem benefits as quickly as possible. And by continuing to advocate for increased cooperative water storage solutions north of Lake Okeechobee to provide additional treatment capacity, reduce excessive water flows, and enable water quality treatment. And finally, we resolve to advocate for equitable water policies that ensure all people have access to clean, safe, and affordable water supplies by researching and assessing where new policy can support environmental justice, and by advocating that local, state, and federal environmental programs and agency decisions are administered fairly and without regard to race. And that concludes the presentation of our water priority, and I'll turn it back over to Mary Jean to introduce the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. And I just do want to point out that Kelly was the lucky speaker that drew the flamingo pictures for her presentation. So that was a much sought after slide. Next up is a state conservation priority for climate. Kristen Kosick is going to present that. Kristen is the engagement manager and conservation leadership and climate initiative. So take it away, Kristen.
All right, we're going to see if my internet will hold out for us too here. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Kosick. I'm the engagement manager for conservation leadership and climate initiatives, and I will be presenting Audubon Florida's climate priorities for the 2024 State Conservation Action Agenda. Climate change knows no boundaries, and Florida is especially vulnerable to its effects. Sea level rise, intensifying storms, and catastrophic wildfires are just some of the impacts we will continue to see as our climate changes. These factors will not only impact birds and wildlife species, but also humans. Protecting our communities and reducing risk to our economy are pressing issues in our state. Outdated infrastructure, destruction of natural flood prevention and carbon storing systems, and greenhouse gas emitting energy sources continue to exacerbate the impacts of climate change in our state. Audubon Florida is dedicated to addressing these threats in order to mitigate climate change through greenhouse gas reduction and to adapt to a changing climate, creating more resilient communities and ecosystems throughout Florida. Therefore, Audubon Florida takes the actions described in the proposed state conservation priority for climate. And I'll summarize some of those major points now. But we will address climate issues by promoting projects that mimic natural processes through the use of natural and hybrid green and gray infrastructure, prioritizing the protection and restoration of our natural ecosystems that form a first line of defense against storms. Some of those include shoreline protection through natural infrastructure, which includes salt marshes, seagrass beds, coral reefs, and mangrove forests, and healthy wetlands that absorb floodwaters, clean water, and act as carbon sinks and water storage structures. We will oppose ecologically harmful and expensive adaptation strategies, including beach armoring, seawalls, and other practices that marginalize or eliminate habitat. We will support policies and programs that assist the development of carbon sequestration projects, such as blue carbon, sustainable forestry, and ranching. We will encourage statewide and regional collaboration through facilitating partnerships amongst governments, organizations, and businesses to analyze climate change impacts and develop region-wide resilience plans, providing landscape-level action and solutions that are both cost-effective and additive. We'll support the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by advocating for adoption of ordinances and programs that promote the conversion to renewable energy efficiency, and electric vehicle readiness. We'll encourage innovation in energy technology, such as battery storage, improved grid technology, in order to expand the availability, resiliency, and efficiency of our renewable energy resources. We'll advocate for the responsible siting and improved planning of utility infrastructure, such as solar fields and wastewater facilities. We'll educate the public and policymakers about climate and resiliency impacts on people, birds and wildlife, habitats, and our water resources. And we'll partner with underserved communities and representative organizations to ensure equitable resilience planning, funding distribution, policies, and outcomes. This completes my presentation for Audubon Florida's climate priorities.
Thank you, Kristen. We're going to turn now to the state conservation priority for working lands. This will be presented by Charles Lee, who is our long-serving and highly effective Director of Advocacy. So take it away, Charles.
Good evening. I'm Charles Lee, Director of Advocacy of Audubon, Florida. Florida is home to 69 distinct ecosystems, and they include thousands of plant and animal species, including many that are rare and endemic and need protection. Out of the 35 million acres in Florida, only 31% so far has been protected as conservation lands. And so the resolved points in this plank of our conservation work focus on how we protect the remainder and also how we keep that 31% in conservation lands. I'm just going to highlight several of the bullets in the body of this, which you all have available to you. Support state laws and encourage local land use decisions and programs that protect conservation lands and provide resources for managing those lands to restore and maintain wildlife and habitats. Just as an example, this month, we faced a 14,000 acre development in critical habitat areas in the Kissimmee watershed. And that's been bouncing around in Osceola County for some time. We've worked with neighboring landowners. We've worked with state agencies. We worked with Osceola County. And the pressure against that development mounted to the point that the developer withdrew the application for 34,000 units that they would have otherwise pursued. That's an example of working in that area. Another bullet point in our plank of activities is increased funding for expansion of conservation easement purchase programs, including less than fee Florida Forever acquisitions and rural and family lands program. Again, just last month, we had a major success in this area. 9,000 acres of Adams Ranch, just south of Lake Marion, stretching almost all the way to State Road 60, was brought into the state's Rural and Family Lands Conservation Easement Program, a unanimous vote by the governor and the cabinet to do that, $24 million for that purchase. Another area where we're working quite hard is to continue the focus on the J-Watch and Eagle Watch programs. And just one example of how that has engaged recently is that we found out that the State Department of Transportation was relying on very old, outdated data for their plotting of Eagle's Nest's location in Florida. We plugged them in to our Eagle Nest locator, which Audubon Florida maintains. And they now have that integrated into their transportation planning sites as of this year. And then the final point that I'd like to make is a recent implementation of one of the bullet points is that we try to influence the direction of transportation projects, roads, expressways, and turnpikes. And there's quite a controversy over something called the Ponciana Parkway extension in Osceola County going on right now. The South Florida Water Management District has been advocating one proposal, and the Central Florida Expressway Authority has been advocating another. And we've weighed in with both of those agencies. And as a result, both of those agencies have pulled back and are reconsidering their positions. And the result, we think, is going to be reorienting that road so that three things happen. One, the road can be built because it's essential. But two, it's going to avoid most of the environmental impact, including incursion on conservation lands. And three, we've moved the South Florida Water Management District into recognizing the protection of a longstanding African American and Hispanic community that would have been damaged by one of the routes. So those are just some of the examples of implementing these efforts to protect the resources on the land.
Thank you, Charles. The last of our, certainly last but certainly not least of our state conservation priorities tonight is bird-friendly communities. Jackie Sulik will be presenting that. Jackie is in charge of chapter conservation.
Thank you, Mary Jean. Well, most of you have probably been out bird watching lately. You understand that migration is in full swing. So this is very relevant to our bird-friendly communities, because we know that Florida is part of the Atlantic Flyway and supports over 500 species, including year-round residents, seasonal nesters, and our migrants. But changing climate and population increases are threatening the very landscapes and resources that birds need to survive. Hazards such as windows, glass on tall buildings, pesticides, and domestic predators decrease the function of these areas for birds. Native plants, as we all know, are the foundation of the food chain and provide shelter and safe spaces and places for birds to raise their young. And yet these have been removed and replaced by exotic species and turf grass. The reflective quality of glass windows in our homes and buildings leads to bird strikes and bright city lights can distract and confuse birds migrating at night, leading to exhaustion, and development reduces natural nesting opportunities. Not so great. But the good news is that we can begin to mitigate these impacts with the choices that we make within our communities. And that's what bird-friendly communities is about. Therefore, be it resolved that Audubon and its partners will, number one, promote and support the Plants for Birds program by selecting native plants for your yards and public landscapes. We can provide vital habitat for birds and bugs and people. Already, 35 out of Audubon Florida's 45 chapters have participated in some type of Plants for Birds program, whether it's a workshop, a plant giveaway, or an installation in their backyards or in public spaces. Number two, minimize building strikes and lighting distractions. So here's an example of some great work. Duval Audubon, St. John's Regional Audubon, Audubon of Southwest Florida, and Tropical Audubon are reaching beyond Florida's borders to share resources and lessons learned from their respective programs. And guess what? The local business owners and decision makers are starting to get the message. Number three, provide good homes for birds. For example, well, we know about Eagle Watch, we know about bluebird trails, but how many chapters now are installing purple martin courts in houses? Well, we have at least a dozen. Quite the trend, and it's been very successful. Number four, increase and engage Audubon membership through outreach, education, and conservation, leading to advocacy. Audubon chapters in Florida really are the backbone of our bird-friendly communities program. With years of experience, they are critical to achieving these goals while engaging both traditional and new and diverse audiences for conservation. As we like to say, where birds thrive, people prosper. And now I'm turning it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. We're going to turn now to our regional conservation priorities. We're going to start with Southwest Florida, and that's going to be presented to you by Bryn Curtis. And you're on mute, by the way.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello? Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay. As she said, I'm Brenda Curtis, representing the Southwest portion of Florida. Audubon has a long history in the Western Everglades region, beginning with the hiring of wardens to protect the wading bird colonies from the plume hunters, and later creating Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, and helping to secure federal and state public lands. There are 5 Audubons in Southwest: the Audubon of Southwest, which is in Fort Myers, the Audubon of Western Everglades, Sanibel Captiva, who's recovering from Hurricane Ian, and Henry Glade and Peace River Audubon, in which I am the president of. Among the climate impacts, increasing temperature and poor water quality that feeds harmful algae blooms remain major threats in our region. This climate issue also intersects with regional wetland protection, restoration, stormwater, and pollution prevention policies. Coinciding with and quite related to climate impacts is the crisis of species declines and extinctions. Audubon organizations see these among avian species, but their food base of insects and plants are just as concerning. Regarding the vitally important issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion, Audubon and its chapters recognize the underrepresentation of diverse communities in our leadership, membership programs, and staff. So, therefore, The 5 local Audubon organizations in Southwest Florida have decided on 4 priorities. The first one is reduce harmful algae blooms in Southwest Florida through nutrient source control, watershed restoration, wetland preservation, and protection of connected coastal and inland habitats from Lake Okeechobee, Caloosahatchee River, Peace River, and Charlotte Harbor, Big Cypress, and of course the Corkscrew Swamps to their downstream estuaries and beaches. We support Audubon calls for advocacy relating to issues such as the improvement of stormwater treatment infrastructure and removal of septic tanks in density populated areas. The second priority is to conserve and enhance wildlife habitat and any land of environmental value. We advocate for the purchase of environmentally sensitive land, conservation easements, and similar measures, especially in Southwest Florida, and connecting to the wildlife corridor. Chapters also wish to support local initiatives such as Plants for Birds campaigns, native tree planting, urban wildlife habitat creation, turf grass conversion to native plants, and reductions of risk to birds from the built environment. The third one is enhanced regional and local sea level rise and climate change adaptation and mitigation planning and implementation. We encourage local governments to participate in resiliency coalitions and promote local and regional measures to lower greenhouse gas emissions and increase resiliency through nature-based strategies such as watershed restoration. Now, the fourth is we want to increase diversity of chapter membership and leadership and support for environmental justice in all our communities. And I turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryn. Our next regional conservation priority will be Everglades, and that's going to be presented to you from Kirsten Hines. Take it away, Kirsten.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Kirsten Hines from Tropical Audubon Society in Miami, and I am here representing the Everglades region in the southeastern corner of the state, running from Palm Beach County down into the Keys in Monroe County. This is an area known for its beautiful beaches, productive estuaries, unique biodiversity, which includes the Everglades ecosystem, and supports some of the highest densities of people in the nation, which presents conservation challenges. Our overarching conservation goals remain the same given the long-term nature of this type of work, but I will highlight some of our focal priorities within these resolutions for 2024. Our first priority is Everglades restoration, and within that, we plan to encourage field trip and program leaders to incorporate messaging about Everglades restoration and its wider ecological benefits in a range of programs to reach and educate new audiences, particularly with the hope that on a bird field trip, people are there seeing it physically at the time that they're hearing the messaging and that it will have a greater impact. Our next priority is bird and wildlife conservation. We will increase our advocacy efforts for species and habitats through programs such as Project Perch, the Purple Martin Landlord Program, the Living Shoreline Program, Shorebird Monitoring, and the Lights Out Program. Our third priority is climate change. And within that, we will encourage the use of nature-based solutions and the adoption of new technologies to combat climate change and sea level rise. And we also feel very strongly about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And within that priority, we will expand our ongoing efforts to offer more bilingual and translated programming, as well as more field trip options for a range of people, including mobility accessible field trips. With that, I will conclude the Everglades Regional Conservation Priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to the Indian River Lagoon, and that's going to be presented by Donna Halloran.
Hi, everybody. I'm Donna Halloran from Pelican Island Audubon, and I'll be representing Audubon Florida Regional Conservation Priority, Indian River Lagoon. Whereas the Indian River Lagoon is a singular treasure whose health begins in the land surrounding it. Over drainage and nutrient pollution, which starts in our watersheds, ends up in our waters. It harms biodiversity and our quality of life. Recent widespread loss of seagrasses, algal blooms, and starving manatees are not acceptable. The Indian River Lagoon Regional Conservation Committee's 2023 conservation priorities continue 4 efforts from last year. Therefore, increase funding for conservation initiatives throughout the region. Seek long-term solutions for protecting water quality. Continue public education on the values of native landscaping and increase equity and inclusion of all people. Clean water is a unifying thread through all of our priorities. The priorities also improve resilience towards an issue of unique importance to the region, sea level rise due to climate change. Chapters will advocate, educate, and perform outreach among all sectors of our community, from our neighbors, the public at large, agency staff, elected officials, through meeting with these officials, attending public meetings, sharing information through individual and form letters, social media, and the press, making presentations, and by any other means to effectively convey our messages. Therefore, be it resolved, the Audubon chapters in the Indian River Lagoon region, in alignment with Audubon Florida and the Atlantic Flyway, using information derived from sound science and motivated by community compassion, will mobilize volunteer leadership, members, conservation allies, community leaders, public officials, and government agencies to 1, support local, regional, and state initiatives to increase funding for land conservation initiatives. 2, develop a culture of clean water. It is essential to our economy and our quality of life. 3, require native landscape for wildlife and water benefits. And then promote equity and inclusion in chapter activities. Highlighting this last priority, to promote equity and inclusion in chapter activities, Audubon and our nation have a reinvigorated focus on historical and ongoing discrimination and inequality in race, gender identity, religion, and other self-identified groups. Audubon has traditionally welcomed all people, but passive acceptance has not created enough interaction with diverse populations. We recognize that we need to foster closer relationships with diverse groups in all activities and recognize it needs to be a reciprocal relationship. We must join them in their community activities on a two-way street of fostering closer relationships. I have completed my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donna. We're going to turn now. The next regional conservation priority will be Central Florida, and that's going to be shared with us by Melissa Lammers.
Good evening. I'm Melissa Lammers, and I'll be presenting the 2024 Regional Conservation Priorities for Central Florida. The 11-chapter area comprising the Central Florida Regional Conservation Committee includes much of the remaining conservation corridor through the central part of the state. So we'll continue our regional priorities of partnering with landowners and property managers to protect habitat, water quality, and water resources. Our specific goals are very long-term and therefore not much change from 2023. We'll continue to promote restoration, visitor access, and a new Audubon Nature Center at Lake Apopka. Lake Apopka is Florida's most important inland bird habitat. It's also the headwater of the Harris Chain of Lakes and an important component of reclaimed water and stormwater management infrastructure. We'll continue to monitor progress of the ongoing restoration of Lake Apopka's North Shore marshes and to press for public access for resource-based recreation like birdwatching. While local and state governments come and go, with some more sympathetic than others to our goals, we will remain steadfast in our efforts to build and operate a new Audubon Center to educate the public about the significance of Lake Apopka. Orange Audubon found a way to offer that education without the center by hiring an ambassador. This reawakened interest in the center and serves as an example of how we continue to seek multiple ways to achieve our goals. Stay tuned. We'll continue to monitor and act on local and state government land use decisions that affect wildlife habitat. In addition to advocating generally for full funding for Florida Forever and the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program, we'll continue to speak with individual elected officials, councils, and commissions to gain support for specific properties like those listed among our priorities. Recently, we wrote letters of support and spoke at a regional meeting of the Acquisition and Restoration Council to place one of those properties, the Yarborough Ranch, on the Florida Forever land buying list, as well as a parcel in Volusia County. We'll continue our efforts to preserve environmentally sensitive habitat in our region. And last, but certainly not least, is equity, inclusion, diversity, and belonging. We know that biodiversity strengthens natural systems, and we believe the same is true for our conservation efforts. The diversity of human experience strengthens what we do for the benefit of nature and all human beings. Each chapter will continue looking for ways to meaningfully increase diversity and inclusion of both its board and its membership, so that they reflect the diversity of the local community and strengthen community connections. Thank you very much, and I have concluded with Central Florida RCC.
Thank you, Melissa. We're going to turn now to the regional conservation priority for the Florida Gulf Coast, and Mary Keith will be our presenter for that.
Good evening. I'm Mary Keith, and I'm the Regional Director for Audubon Florida Gulf Coast and the Conservation Chair for Tampa Audubon. We too, Gulf Coast, have 11 counties. We stretch from northern Charlotte County to Citrus County, up to Cedar Key. So it's quite a spread out area. As we were meeting and discussing all of these, one of the things that we all agreed on were the problems that we are all diversely facing with the growing urbanization, the burgeoning human population in our area. And because most of us are coastal, the climate change, sea level rise, we've had algal blooms as well. Ours, in larger part, have come from gypsum stacks leaking and draining millions of gallons of polluted water into Tampa Bay, and then that's spreading up and down the shore. So we have 4 priorities, working to include climate change in our existing work through education and communication, expanding the effectiveness of Audubon through our various EDI activities, supporting youth education and involvement, the CLI program, as well as our Young Birders clubs. And then our 4th, and the one that we seem to have the most activity on, taking an active role in local and regional habitat protection by working with and supporting, identifying, and helping to train advocates for speaking at local and regional public meetings on issues of coastal and environmentally sensitive areas, using all of our various activities from chapter field trips and Christmas bird counts to various bird population surveys around our various counties. And it's not in our priorities, but just as an example of this, working with regional meetings, today I participated in the Tampa Bay Association of Environmental Protection, their luncheon meeting, and seated at the table with me were people from 3 different environmental consulting groups, businesses in the area, and why I identified myself as with Audubon. Oh, you have Eagle Watch. Oh, I've been working with the shorebird monitoring. Oh, Jay Watch, we use their data. So that's just an example of how our work spreads out into the businesses of environmental protection. And that's the main priority, or the top priority that our Gulf Coast region is working on to support all of these various programs. So with that, I will pass it on to the next person.
Thank you, Mary. Next up, Jim Brady's going to tell us what's going on in Northwest Florida and what those priorities are. You there, Jim?
There we go. Hi, I'm Jim Brady. I live in Pensacola, the western gate to the Sunshine State, where thousands live the way millions wish they could. And I'm going to tell you about our conservation priorities for Northwest Florida. Florida's Panhandle and the Big Bend coastal areas are among the most beautiful, least damaged, and ecologically productive regions of the state. This region includes spectacular beaches, 4 major bay and estuary systems, marshes, and floodplains that are home to some of the most diverse wildlife in North America. Northwest Florida's coastal economy is largely based on being a destination for beach and water-based recreation and tourism. The region also has a rich, fishery that supports both recreational and commercial fishing. The Panhandle is also home to several important military bases, which harbor thousands of acres of wildlife and forests. Of all the regions in the state, Northwest Florida was the most impacted by the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill disaster. In the wake of that event, our remaining coastal wildlife and habitat are more important than ever. Therefore, let it be resolved that the 4 Audubon chapters in the Northwest Florida region, in alignment with Audubon Florida and the Atlantic Flyway, using information derived from sound science, will mobilize volunteer leadership, members, conservation allies, community leaders, public officials, and government agencies to build the case for strategic land conservation and sustainability in the Panhandle using a variety of tools. We will mutually support chapters across the Panhandle on conservation activities and projects that engage the collective power of an inclusive community invested in environmental equity and justice. Interestingly, all 4 of our chapters have a conservation project near the center of our communities, and they are embedded in a traditionally Black neighborhood. We will initiate integrated planning among Panhandle chapters to develop viable support plans for maintenance of chapter conservation activities. We will protect and sustain the Panhandle's biodiversity by supporting the DoD-sponsored Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape Program, partnering with established and evolving Panhandle estuary programs, and by supporting other programs of interest to Audubon Florida Conservation Mission. And finally, we will continue to support the acquisition and management of critical conservation lands with particular emphasis on Florida Forever projects. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Jim. Amy, we're going to let you close it out by giving us the regional conservation priority for Northeast Florida, if you will.
Good evening. You're saving the best for last. The Northeast Regional Conservation Committee covers 16 counties, from Nassau to Flagler along the coast, and Marion to Hamilton inland. We're served by 7 Audubon chapters, and we harbor unique water resources, a variety of ecosystems, and climate strongholds to support resident wildlife and the birds of the Atlantic Flyway. Our beaches happen to be the beaches and dunes, happen to be one of the last significant nesting sites for shorebirds and seabirds on the east coast of Florida. Our extensive coastal marshes are home to resident bird species and provide essential breeding and foraging ground for migrating birds. Our inland includes some of the largest magnitude springs in the world, with outflows feeding rivers such as the Alakawaha, St. John's, Silver, and Suwannee. Large sandhill lakes provide for recharge of the Florida aquifer. These systems are being severely affected by excessive nutrients and overpumping of the aquifer. Mining, surface water withdrawals, and dredging pose additional threats to the region. Local communities dependent on nature-based economies are suffering from the degradation of these water resources. Therefore, the 7 chapters of the Northeast RCC have resolved that they're going to engage. I'm just going to sort of give the highlights. We're going to be engaging partners or continuing to engage our partners to achieve regional conservation goals, which would include resiliency planning, support for alternative energy, promoting the value of treatment wetlands. We have a lot of agricultural area left. Improve the management of conservation lands, and work with towards state and local policies to improve bird habitat. We also are going to participate and encourage our members to participate in monitoring and stewardship programs, including the Florida Shorebird Alliance, Eagle Watch, Jay Watch, the Kestrel box monitoring that we do inland, Lights Out Northeast Florida, the Prairie Creek Preserve Bird Banding Lab, and other local partnerships. We are also going to be encouraging our members, as well as chapters statewide, to develop volunteer programs and participate in the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute's 2024 Wading Bird Survey. We understand in our area that there have been underrepresented groups in conservation for years and years and years, and we are striving to make efforts to reduce that problem by reaching out to local leaders of underrepresented groups to understand their concerns about conservation and environmental issues. We want to develop programs and events that would encourage participation by diverse groups and invite local leaders of underrepresented groups to participate in our leadership, chapter leadership, and advocacy work and field activities. And we plan to collaborate with schools and libraries to spread conservation messages and foster appreciation of the natural world within our region. And that concludes our goals for 2024.
Thank you, Amy. That actually also concludes all of the presentations, the overviews of the state conservation priorities, as well as the regional conservation priorities. And I want to thank all the presenters for the good job you did in trying to convey a lot of information in a short period of time. This brings us to the point where we're ready to vote to approve these priorities. And Erica, I'm going to turn to you to walk us through how that vote's going to take place.
Great. Thank you so much. So the vote is going to take place in 2 batches. The first is going to be of the 5 Audubon Florida policy and conservation priorities, and then followed by the 7 regional conservation priorities. And so we're going to do one at a time, and you have to fill out each one, yes or no, or it won't let you submit. If you have any problems, you can put your yes, no's in the chat, and I'll record it that way. But you shouldn't have any problems. I tried to make it as easy as possible. All right. State conservation and policy priorities has been launched. Staff, you cannot participate, just as a heads up. So staff cannot vote. Great job. 10 of you have already participated. Thank you. If you presented on behalf of an RCC, you can absolutely vote. And I have not counted the staff that are on this call, so I will just give it about a minute or until things stop. So far, we're unanimous, so that's great. All right, I'm going to give it 10 more seconds. If anyone's having any trouble, put it in the chat. Okay, hearing none, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Coastal conservation, 100%. Water, 100%. Climate, 100%. Working lands, 100%. Bird-friendly communities, 100%. acceptance. Okay, I'm going to switch over to the other poll. Okay, you should be able to see the regional conservation priorities. There are 7 of these, so most of you on most desktops are going to need to scroll down. I believe I had 30 participants last time, so I'm going to wait for 30 participants this time. Okay, I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. I believe we're all set though, but just a few more seconds. Okay, there's my 30. I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. All, I believe, are at 100%. Southwest Florida, Everglades, Indian River Lagoon, Central Florida, Florida Gulf Coast, Northwest, and Northeast Florida. Congratulations, everybody. We have a conservation agenda. Norman, I see that it would not scroll beyond 3 for you. I will stay on if you want to record your vote with me, and I'll make sure that it's recorded. You can just chat it to me if you want, and I'll make sure it's recorded. All right, I turn it back to our host to close this out.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Again, a special round of thanks to the presenters and to everyone who called in and stuck with us through the whole time, voted. As Erica says, we do now have a conservation agenda, and we'll see that and talk more about that at Assembly next week. I hope everybody's able to attend. And I think that's it for the evening. You should be very proud of us. We kept it under 1 hour. So hope everyone has a nice evening, and we'll look for you next week down in Tampa, Brandon. Good night.